good morning, good night, wherever you're calling in from, and hello and welcome to those of you in the room with us. My name is Rez Gardi, and I'm the co-managing director of Refugee Seeking Equal Access at the Table, R-SEAT, and I'm honored to be here with you today to moderate this discussion. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting here in Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. For thousands of years, they have cared for and protected this land. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I recognize that this history reminds us of the deep connections between displacement, dispossession, and the right to live in dignity. We're gathering today at a time of profound challenge. Global responses to forced migration are at a critical juncture. While displacement is at a record high, access to protection and solutions have become increasingly unreliable. The global system designed to ensure collective action and effective responses is unraveling in light of massive funding cuts and political divisions. This year is especially pivotal, with a new UN High Commissioner for Refugees to be selected and the upcoming global meeting to review progress on current commitments to respond to displacement. Against this backdrop, today's conversation is about possibility as much as it is about crisis. How can we overcome the current moments of crisis and imagine a new response to forced migration where all forced migrants have timely and reliable access to protection and a place to live in dignity? Through this roundtable, we will discuss the objectives of a new 6-year partnership between forcibly displaced-led organizations, researchers and academics, civil society organizations, and other partners. The goal of this partnership is for the knowledge and expertise of those most affected by displacement to be more substantively informing forced migration research and the global refugee regime, which we hope will lead to more effective, legitimate, and accountable research, policy, and practice. At the core of our partnership is a shared belief that a deeply inclusive, interdisciplinary, partnered, and localized approach to the co-production of knowledge can transform forced migration research and the policy process by amplifying the agency of those most affected by displacement. And to discuss how the power of partnership can overcome this moment of crisis and imagine a more reliable and legitimate global response to displacement, we have an esteemed panel of speakers. It's my great pleasure to introduce, beginning with, to my left, Maria Diez, the president of the Coalition for Venezuela. To her left, Professor James Milner, project director of LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. To my immediate right, Stephanie López Villamil, Gerda Henkel Foundation Scholarship recipient and South America project lead researcher. And last but not least, on the end on my right, my co-managing director at R-SEAT, Mustafa Alio. Thank you all for being here. And to get right into the conversation, I would like to ask a question to set the scene and get your perspectives coming from different regions and working in different sectors. And so I'll go to you first, Ana Maria. What are the challenges that you're seeing in your sector and region today?
Thank you so much, Rez, and good day, everyone. Good night, everyone. Specifically, my organization, which is an umbrella organization, is called Coalition for Venezuela. But besides our last name, Venezuela, we are not focusing on Venezuelans only, but on those in forced displacement in Latin America. So Latin America is one of the critical continents in the world. Why? Because there are so many challenges since so many years that hasn't been addressed. But especially the Venezuelan crisis, it's one of the biggest in the world. It's 8 million persons that been forcibly displaced, going through different borders. Many of you might have seen the Darien Gap, the Darien Jungle, which is hell on earth, and now it's closed, which doesn't mean that the crisis has stopped. Nothing more away from that. But the thing is that when the funding cuts happen, so many networks and so many NGOs, so many local initiatives, and so many government initiatives shut down without a plan. That implies significant risk to the loss of life. People now are trying to cross to the Caribbean Ocean, trying to reach one of the Caribbean islands, and risking themselves to be trafficked and losing their lives. So people keeps moving between borders in South America, trying to reach some other countries, North America, Central America, with pre-existing gangs, which is a whole new level of challenges to be addressed. So this is the context of very complex Latin America, and I'm pretty sure that Stephanie can go deeper into the Latin American context. But as for the Venezuelan context, we are now facing significant challenges for those that are now being forced to exile. It's a new wave. It's human rights defenders that are fleeing Venezuela and their families. That being said, people are now trying to reach the European dream instead of the American dream. So Spain, the country that I live now, has broken all of their records with asylum seekers. And nonetheless, none of the countries in Latin America nor in Europe has been able to face these challenges in time. So there is a lot of barriers to overcome for regularization, to provide people to access to health, to a way to live inside of those countries and to provide to those countries alternatives. So it's a very complicated situation, especially for a Venezuelan to say this, because we are not fully recognized as a refugee crisis. So I think this summarizes the overall challenges that we have as Venezuelans trying to advocate for answers.
Thanks, Ana Maria. And from what you've highlighted, it's clear that closing paths to safety doesn't mean that people will stop trying to reach safety. They just find alternative routes and often even more dangerous pathways to try to get out. And it seems in this situation, by closing these existing journeys that people are taking, they're now subject to even more dangerous pathways. I want to go to you, Mustafa. From your perspective, R-SEAT working at a more global level, could you tell us what kind of challenges you're seeing in your work?
I think right now, Ana Maria mentioned a lot of definitely kind of challenges the refugees face, in whether from Venezuela or Latin America. And I think this, in a way or another, applied to so many other regions on the idea that today the refugee and forced displacement in general is facing a critical challenge, not only because of the number of refugees. I think this is always where people start with number of refugees, like unprecedented number, and then that's number kind of keep growing. But I think what's unique about the challenge right now is that this is the rise in anti-refugee sentiment across the globe, the rise in trying to find ways around the Geneva Convention and the protection of refugees, the rise of ideas for externalization, the cut in funding, and while the governments keep saying that it's just basically it's an economical situation, but then you look at the amount of money states and the global community spends on border securities is about 5 times more what being spent on the needs of refugees, and sometimes even more than that. So the idea, and I think that this is a huge challenge we're facing, even with R-SEAT and as an organization that we try to advocate and work with governments to enhance the responses for refugees through making bridges and engagement between governments and refugee experts. And always our approach that trying to have those very tough conversation with government on the idea of like, it's not about just this is the right thing to do. it is an issue. It is a problem that even maybe we're all facing, but in particular, if refugees not only facing, but this is affecting the life. Like it's a life or death sentence for us, and how can we together work in a way that maybe we figure out a practical way of bringing solutions to, or new solutions or innovative solutions in terms of that kind of a partnership. But I feel what I want to end on is today, honestly, the challenge is that there are so many challenges and like what battle we need to pick and what area we need to focus on. And is it, go into panic mode and focus so much on short term and kind of a more protection and aid on the ground? Is it the long term and trying to propose solutions and advocacy to rethink the whole issue of refugee and forced displacement and responses? And I think that's one of the upcoming challenge that I feel in advocacy. It's going to be very critical.
I want to go to you next, Stephanie, from the research that you've been doing in Latin America in particular. What kind of challenges has your research enlightened?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. So, for context, I did research on South America, particularly in Colombia and Brazil. And I know what I'm going to mention is a topic that's been spoken for a while, and we know what the problem is, but here we are with this project that LERRN is launching in these meetings, are looking at the responses to this problem. So, the decision of President Trump to freeze foreign aid on the first day of his administration and ultimately terminate USAID, the agency responsible for foreign aid, has had devastating effects on the communities. And particularly, and I will speak here specifically in the case of Colombia, we were the first recipient, Colombia was the first recipient of aid from USAID, followed in the second place by Haiti, which are, Colombia is receiving 3 million displaced Venezuelans, while Haiti is in a political turmoil and crisis, and has been for a while. So 2 countries that needed this funding are being defunded, but this is where you see the real impact of this is in the communities. When you go to the communities, and I've been in the past months going to the communities and speaking to refugee leaders, so what's happening in your own communities, there's still humanitarian needs. And I don't want to dig into this the triple nexus in development, but it's something that we should keep thinking about when we think about responses. And moreover, and I think Ana Maria had already talked about this and given a glimpse of what's happening all over Latin America, but we are now receiving a mix of, we are seeing a mix of movements. We have hundreds and hundreds of deportees arriving to our countries every single day. I don't know how many millions are spent on these deportation flights and these deportation processes. So all these policies that come from the US really affect Latin America very, very, the impact is really big. It has not been measured yet, but shifting policies without providing the resources needed to handle this responsibility it's having a consequence on the asylum systems. And the asylum system in Latin America is, in the different countries, is very weak in general. They're one of 2 countries that have a really strong asylum system, but overall they have very fragile asylum systems. And with this defunding, it's even worse. So it's many countries are right now under pressure. So I think the next question would be, where should the international community step in? And I think maybe we can discuss about this in the next point.
Thanks, Stephanie. And Absolutely. The mass deportation that's happening in this region, and also we've seen around the globe with millions of Afghan refugees deported. We're seeing mass policies of externalization and efforts to keep people out at a time where we desperately need more protection and strengthening of the asylum system. We're seeing the exact opposite. I want to go to you, James, to tell us a little bit more about the challenges you're seeing in your field.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rez, and thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful to be part of this conversation. From the perspective where I sit as a very privileged academic at a global north university, and from the perspective of having studied the politics of the global refugee regime for the past quarter century, it's no exaggeration to say that I think we find ourselves at a moment where we will likely witness the rupture of the global refugee regime as we know it within the next year, if that has not already happened. And so I choose those words very, very carefully. And the reason that I feel that we are at this potential moment of rupture is because the deal that was struck to establish the global refugee regime as we know it in the aftermath of World War II, that deal has been broken. The deal was when UNHCR was established and the institutions of the refugee regime were set up, there were competing visions of the regime, one from India and Pakistan and newly independent states, who called for a regime that was independent and an organization that had a political mandate. The United States had a very different vision in the early days of the Cold War, saying it wanted a UNHCR, it wanted a UN agency that was reliant on the voluntary contributions of states. But the deal was that the United States would then provide that financial support. And what we have seen over more than 75 years is across administrations, the United States honoring that deal. More than a third of voluntary contributions to UNHCR for decades has been from the United States. And so the concern that I have is that it's not only the institutions of the regime, it's not only the political backlash against the norms of the regime, it's the very implicit deal that was struck to create the regime in the first place. Stephanie made mention of how the international community should respond. How can we articulate that an international community currently exists? And so the whole premise of the refugee protection regime in the preamble of the 1951 convention, it talks about the need for international cooperation to address the challenges of receiving refugees and ensuring that their rights are upheld. And so the concern that I have is not only the profound consequences of the episode that we're observing, of funding cuts and the consequences in particular contexts, but the entire structure that we've come to know, that in and of itself is at risk. And so how the institution is responding, how a discussion of a new High Commissioner of Refugees is engaging actively with this question of how do we face this profound structural historic moment, that's the challenge that we face. But then turning the lens in, it comes at a time where academia, those who are provided surpluses in society to struggle with these great questions, academia, and certainly within the field of refugee and forced migration studies, is also facing a moment of reckoning in moving away from academic practice that is extractive, academic practice that is premised on advancing the careers of individual academics and competition between different institutions who seek to promote themselves, to secure funds, and to promote recruitment. And so I think the challenge that we face is to recognize the political economy of knowledge production that has limited the impact of forced migration studies and the work of Chimney and Landau and many others. But also to recognize why is it that academic institutions and academic research is losing credibility in the public eye. And I think the challenge that we face is dual. At the very moment where the institutions of the refugee regime are so profoundly under threat, we also face this challenge: can academia provide a meaningful piece of finding the solution?
And James, flowing from that thought, I mean, I want to ask you then, you've asked this question, which I'm sure many in the room are also thinking about in their roles and within academia and as partner organizations to this particular project. What change do you see then as possible?
I'm gonna quote you, Rez, and something that you said earlier this day. We're just at the end of a 2.5-day process to launch the new LERRN partnership, and at the beginning of this conversation, Rez said that we all need to have the courage to think differently. And I think that this is a moment where there are so many incentives to try and maintain a status quo that has privileged certain actors. And so I think the way that we respond to this moment is to have that courage to think differently. It's to have the courage to trust and to recognize that there's no one sector or set of actors that have a monopoly on truth, to recognize that knowledge and expertise has its origins in very different places. And finally, to recognize that yes, there are profoundly acute challenges that we face today, but the challenges have been growing for decades, and that lasting change takes time. And so just the last point that I would make there is to offer that optimism of what becomes possible when you have that willingness to take that step to trust. And I want to give credit to someone called Mustafa Alio, who may be watching this webinar, and if he is, I want to say thank you to him. Because it was a conversation with him in 2018 that introduced to me the question of meaningful refugee participation in the governance of the refugee regime, and how I have benefited from the trust and confidence that Osama showed to me, and then Mustafa, and then Rez, and then so many others in building that honest, equitable, trust-based relationship to recognize we all bring some tools to the table. And what we have seen, even in these incredibly impossible times, we have seen these tiny moments of incremental positive change. And so I think the way that we rise to the challenge now is building trust, run the long race, recognize that the problems are deep and structural, and that through sincere partnership and collaboration that is focused not on our individual priorities, but a collective vision of the possibility of change, not to try and sustain a status quo from which many of us benefit, but to have that courage to think differently. And that's where I have hope for the future.
Thanks, James. And you mentioned throughout your response the importance of building trust between obviously forcibly displaced people and academia. I want to go to you, Ana Maria, and from the perspective of someone who works directly on the ground with people forcibly displaced, and your organization is one of these key partners in this new project. Firstly, why did your organization want to be involved in something like this? You know, what change did you see as being possible? And then kind of, I guess, a follow-up to that, as an organization like yours, how do you think we can build trust amongst these diverse groups? What is important for those that you work with on the ground in these kind of partnerships to ensure that they're equitable?
Thank you for that wonderful question. And I'm going to connect both of you because for refugee-led organizations and refugee leaders, we have always been thinking differently from the beginning because we have lived different from those, from the donor perspective, from the government perspective, from different perspectives. So we have already done that. So that allows us a certain capacity to innovate in our answers. So what we really need is that now that the world as we know it has changed, we need to reshape this space to allow innovation. And innovation can take many forms. Innovation can take the form of new partnerships. We've been called so many times implementing partners. Why not just partners without the implementing part? Because partnership means the ability to listen to each other. It means co-creating. It means also share the responsibilities Because when a donor finishes their grant making and replies from a territory, we're still living there.
Mm-hmm.
We're still facing those communities in needs. We are the ones staying and providing answers, even not knowing how to do it. So I do think that the trust building goes both ways, but also implies investing properly.
Mm.
And I'm thinking not just as investing projects, but investing capacity.
Yeah.
It is more than ever necessary that these investments go through the capacity building, but really capacity building within the needs that refugee leaders and refugee organization needs to the job to be done. And also the capacity to growth in knowledge and how to do it properly with the responsibility from all. And also in the decision makings, I mean, looking backwards, years ago, no one was willing to give refugee a voice in a space because the fear of what refugee might say.
Yeah.
Now we can look at this also trust that has been built. We are not the enemies. We're just trying to do the same as you do, which is provide answers and achieve the same goals that we have. The ways might be different, but we want the same. So it's those honest conversations and also honoring those spaces that we are granted to do very good.
And I guess taking it from a different perspective, Stephanie, obviously your work has been deeply rooted in the research that you've been doing across the region and connecting both what's been happening regionally to what's been happening in the global space on refugee leadership, the experiences of refugee-led organizations and forcibly displaced people. For you being a partner in this particular project, what gives you hope? What do you want to achieve as this partnership? You know, what do you see as it being the most exciting part as a researcher connected to the work?
That's also a very good question. Thank you, Rez. I think since the beginning, and I will go back like 10 years ago or so, when I started migration research, I was so disappointed because we didn't include refugees or migrants in our research. And I was like deeply saddened by this. And I was starting my PhD, and then suddenly in Colombia, where I come from, we were receiving thousands and thousands of Venezuelans every day. So my research was on another topic. It was Colombian returnees from conflict. But then there was a momentum. And I think what's exciting about this partnership, and since I've known of the existence of LERRN as a partnership, I think what's really, really been exciting is getting to know different RLOs in different parts of the world and knowing refugees themselves and acknowledging they have the same capacity as, as James says, a white male in the North, to do research and to ask the same questions. And I found like truly great partners in different regions of the world that are part now of the new partnership in LERRN 2.0. So I think what's been exciting to me is hearing them, but not like what you were saying, James, about the extractivism, but working as equals in research. And I think what's exciting about these partnerships is that it gives us the opportunity to keep doing this work and to keep making them visible. And I'm particularly eager to write with them, to work with them, to also move from the global north and be able to publish in our own language, which is Spanish, and communicate in Spanish. And I have been part also of the training sessions for them to access the global spaces. And I think that's been really interesting in your part of the question, like how this links my regional work with what is happening at the global level. And for the last GRF in 2023, what we thought with LERRN and R-SEAT was why isn't this training in Spanish? Why it always has to be in English? So I was like volunteering to teach them like some key things about advocacy and how to prepare their messages to a global level. And some of them, it was the first time they were flying on a plane, the first time. They know no English, and you have a lot of barriers there that I'm not going to address today. But I think this project can also contribute to having more refugee voices, not only at the global spaces like GRF and others, but also in academia. And I think that's like key and super important to address.
Thanks, Stephanie. And Mustafa, in your work, I mean, you mentioned earlier that in the crisis that we're in now, there's this urgent question of, do we focus on these urgent reactions and aid, and obviously important reactions to what's happening at the grassroots level, but at the same time, the long-term sustainability, the advocacy of system change is critical as well. In your opinion, as a refugee-led organization that works on system change, what is possible through a partnership like this with academics, researchers, and other organizations in a academic kind of research project? That's what it is essentially, right? Why is that important for a refugee-led organization like R-SEAT?
I think I want to go back to the point of think differently we start with, and also reflecting on early conversation with James, Osama, I think part of the group in Geneva, but also with few other movement of refugees, and this kind of interaction that happened back in 2018. For the first time, I think many refugees come together just trying to have a conversation from different angles at this point. And I think one of the first thing in 2018, we realized, all of us, that often refugees don't talk to each other, like from different the Afghan refugees with the Syrians, with the Venezuelans. This conversation doesn't exist, and we often, or before until today, I think to a big part of it, most refugees just kind of focus on their community. But then beyond that is also, we don't talk to even other key stakeholders within the system. And obviously, early on, we realized right away that it's a trust issues. I think refugees so much on the ground beyond just trying to respond and come up with a program and trying to be a survival, and at the same time provide to our families and our friends and the community. But there's this kind of also side of almost the whole system is against us, the whole system doesn't want us. And that been engraved into our head to the point is like, there's no point for us even to try, and let's just each group get together. I'm saying all of this to say that I think academia, in a way or another, played a little bit more a neutral role. Academia was the only, in my opinion, entity where somehow still to be seen a little bit neutral by the refugees and the community. I mean, the fact that academia doesn't have decision-making power, yes, it influences decision makers, but doesn't have that kind of power. And I think that led, in a way or another, for refugees to at least be able and have a chat initially with the academia, where, and let's be honest, that also refugees don't trust even the UN agencies that support them, like UB on the ground, and you hear it from many. But and whether this is true or not, like the idea of like, are the community doing a good job or not, or whether we can debate this, but at the end there is that kind of a trust issue on how to rebuild it. And honestly, I feel that academia has been playing, in the last, like you and I, Rez and Maria and a few others, kind of refugees that have been involved in this kind of movement of refugee participation and building this. And the more and more we reflect on this, it was actually two key actors that play a good part. A, the conversation between the different refugee groups. B, it was this kind of a partnership with academia to play the role of, breaking the ice and maybe kind of a bridge the refugees with the community or the other stakeholders. UN and decision makers often go back to academia and research in terms of to be informed by their decision and to get it. And I think refugees, to us at this point, we wanted this kind of an angle that how can we speak and how can we talk the language decision makers and other UN agency in a way that they understand it, in a way that kind of respect it, in a way that a bit neutral, that they don't always have this kind of in their mind that there is something, this refugee group is coming to talk to me, not because it's kind of a neutral. They did not think about refugees. And I think today this is one of the challenges we face, that they don't think about refugees in a way that we want to try to provide answers. They think about it more that they wanted something for themselves. And that's why, whatever judgment or whatever request they have, it's basically not fully neutral, not fully built on data, not fully built on kind of a more of an evidence. It's just built on emotions. And I think that's part of the misperception. And I feel academia can play that role. That kind of a bridge in building, I wouldn't say in building trust for refugees within the system, but building trust for refugees that engaging with the system is possible. That change is possible. And at the same time, connecting those policy innovators, because I think right now with all the changes that we have, I think we all agree that we need to think differently. And those innovators in the policy, whether the one that they agree with us or not, they also want a new way of approaching responses for refugees. And often they would go to academia in this way. And I think this is the huge role that academia can play and have been playing.
Yeah, and what you've highlighted there is also through the description of the kind of relationships that existed is obviously the shift from being subjects of academic research to then utilizing the power and the privilege that academic spaces can also provide to helping with the kind of goals and solutions and ideas that we have in partnership with academia. So being involved in that kind of co-producing knowledge, co-producing the research, and also using the data and evidence that we rely on academics for also helping us with the recommendations that we have and want to put forward, the solutions that we have as refugee organizations, obviously on the ground, that don't have the privilege of seizing when the funding cuts happen, or going home and saying, okay, that we're no longer funded to do this particular project, that have to continue regardless of what kind of challenges and crisis mode that is thrown at us. We have to continue because our lives depend on it. And so you've highlighted, various different angles of how the research, the partnerships, the relationships can be used for this solution-based approach. And I want to also echo what you've said, this idea that refugees have always been thinking differently, but it's about now having the space to present those ideas that we've been talking about for so long, and reshaping the space to allow for those innovative approaches. I would like to open the floor maybe for questions from our audience here.
Or if there are any online.
If there are any, or online, yes. I can see a hand in this side, so I'll go to you.
This is working? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias por sus palabras. And Mustafa, you raised this, the securitization of migration. But this question is more for Ana Maria. On this question of the securitization of migration, what are your thoughts on what's happening in Central America, the south-to-south migration, of Venezuelans, Colombians, Ecuadorians that arrive in Central America? And there's these policies in Costa Rica in particular now, particularly under President Chavez, of anti-immigration, xenophobia. The Spanish word monos, monkeys, the way they're being treated and what they're being called in Central America. Just maybe your thoughts on Panama's clawback on immigration laws in Central America in response to what has been hundreds of thousands of refugees the last 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question because it points out how many challenges we have. And this comes and goes every time there is a change of government in different South American countries, in even Central America. Thing is that when the US talks, the other countries listen and follows that lead. Costa Rica is not the only example. Also Panama, also even Colombia, and it's heartbreaking because they start to shift completely into a de-Venezuelized migration. That's horrible to hear, especially from our country that's been our brothers and sisters since our very existence. But it's also the same speeches, hate speeches we have been hearing in Chile and in other countries that keeps going and going and going. And unfortunately, that's not just hate speeches, but implies policymaking, restrictive policymaking. So now this has escalated into drug cartels related and things. So it's a label being tagged to all Venezuelans, and it's job permits that's been revoked, parents that cannot now continue having their kids if the kids it's born in one of those countries. So this is few examples in several countries in South America, but also in European countries. So I think there is a huge responsibility when a decision maker gives one step in a direction of other, because the world is watching this, and not just at governmental level, but at all levels. So yeah.
The question on the Sharika plan that was posed online, I can take that if you can.
Yes, there's a question posed online around what's your view on the Sharika plan launched by the government of Kenya to integrate refugees into the national system without any meaningful inclusion of the refugees at the table of decision making, and also without effective framework for inclusion. James, go ahead.
No, I'm very happy to take that, and Aten, thank you for posing that question, because I think it provides exactly the content to be able to understand why what we're discussing on this panel, this is not propaganda. This is not sort of, a rainbows and tambourines moment to say that what we're doing makes us feel good and that's why we're doing it. This is exactly a moment to understand why this approach of refugee participation, research that is co-produced with those most affected by displacement, is not just an ethically desirable thing to do, it's a substantively useful thing to do. And Anna Maria, to your point, is it points to what are more effective solutions. The Sharika plan is an excellent example of this. So in this post-2015, post-New York Declaration spirit of refugee inclusion, but again, part of this next phase of the deal between refugee hosting states in low and middle income countries in the global south and donors in the global north, where there's this new phase of the deal that was struck. If you offer more progressive approaches to refugee inclusion, there'll be more resources that come from the donor community. So the initiative of the Sharika plan, the definition of success was less to do with the meaningful inclusion and the substantive utility of new institutional arrangements, and more to do with positioning in terms of attracting development resources to marginal places in the Kenyan state. So what we see right now is not only in countries like Kenya, Colombia, for example, with a regularization status, in Ethiopia with the Makatet plan, there are countries who were interrogating policies of inclusion that was premised on a particular political economy of engagement with the international donor community. So the moment that we see that promise of resources is no longer there, the question becomes, how do you continue the positive momentum of inclusion and the substantive value of harnessing the capacity that refugees have, not only in delivering services, but in contributing to an economy, let alone a rights-based argument? We see right now, in response to the cuts in donor funding, that there are some states like, and I will name them, Pakistan, Jordan have gone on the record and said in a world where there are fewer resources, we should focus those resources in country of origin so that refugees can go home and stay home. And then there are those other countries who are saying, well, maybe in a world of fewer resources for care and maintenance programs, maybe inclusion and maybe leveraging the capacities of refugees can not only enable us to host refugees with fewer resources, but actually contribute to drivers of a local economy. So the role of refugee participation, and Mustafa, to your piece about linking experience across different contexts, it's how do you take those moments, those episodic examples of where inclusion has created benefits not only for refugees but host communities and hosting states, and how do you scale those up? As an academic sitting here on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, studying Kenya, studying Tanzania, I don't know those everyday realities. Who knows those realities? Are those living and working on the ground in places like Dadaab and Garissa, in places like Turkana and Kakuma? So that's the knowledge and expertise that helps us understand how we make not a rights-based argument, rights are important, but the decision makers, they respond to those substantive benefits that come from taking new public policy approaches. To the question of, what do I think the consequences will be? The Sharika plan, the Makata plan, all of these other plans now face this existential moment. Are they going to continue in light of the new funding reality, or will they be withdrawn? And I think being able to mobilize that evidence, that situational evidence, but that structural evidence, that new approaches are not only ethically desirable, but substantively useful, that argument won't necessarily come from those institutional actors that benefit from a continuation of large humanitarian budgets. And so where will that argument be found? That argument will be found by the kinds of partnerships that we're discussing today.
And I was going to just go to Mustafa briefly. I mean, R-SEAT's been working directly in Kenya for many years now, led by our regional lead, Jean-Marie Ishimwe, on this particular topic of meaningful refugee participation within the Sharika plan and in partnership with government and other actors. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that in response to the question?
Yes, I think in response to the question, it was great to see the concept of refugee participation within the Sharika plan, kind of high when it comes to language, and obviously it kind of a little bit more of the obvious choice. I mean, the whole premise of the Sharika plan, and I think this has been some of the even earlier model, even though they did not work fully or maybe did not achieve the success that everyone aimed for, and then we try and kind of Sharika plan to maybe learn from those mistakes in the past, is that yes, refugee inclusion should be part of that, and it's great to see it in there. And what R-SEAT has been working with the Kenyan government and many other partners is exactly on this. Then what is the exact process and how refugees can be engaged, not only at the end for them to be included within the national system, but then from the get-go in terms of where and what is the team and what kind of body that would work with the Kenyan government and the donor community and the civil society and around the Sharika plan, as refugees definitely are the ones who are the most interested in the success of the Sharika plan. So we've been again kind of lucky and adamant on the idea that working closely with the Kenyan government and other stakeholders in there. We have actually conducted a few months ago, I was in Nairobi, and we conducted the first ever kind of convening among all community and stakeholders, where we build a concept note on what a refugee inclusion, or basically refugee participation in the shaping and the ideation and the building of the Sharika plan and advancing the Sharika plan. I think we have a bit of now of a framework. We have a paper that's being published, and we are continuing working with many stakeholders, including, I think, a near future visits even to Kakuma and Dadaab, and just trying kind of to build this plan further. But yes.
Building off what was just discussed, where do we see that gap between research and action? How do we build that policy bridge between decision makers and research being able to fulfill those policy needs that we are researching today in terms of refugee crises around the world?
You want to attempt it?
Let's hear your answer. Write it down.
No, it's the same that I said
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
It's so funny. I have to share this again because I said it earlier today. Is that one of our main activities is advocacy based on evidence to provide solutions or proposals for better policymaking with a scope of human rights. And very often we have found me and my teammates in spaces with dialogues with a specific proposal for a specific law to be reformed or anything. And I keep hearing like, oh, this is the refugee opinion, even if it comes with facts. So it's not an opinion, but it does have this huge weight on not having this bridge that you're talking about built alongside with academia and to advocate for the same things, but to start mitigating those narratives. It's not opinion, it's fact-based. But academia has its role there for enable these dialogues to be trust-built.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think I'll use a very specific example of where that has happened. And it came around efforts to develop a definition of what is a refugee-led organization and to work with UNHCR to have that definition accepted. And here were the key parts of the ingredient, is that was identified as a priority not by academics, but by refugee-led organizations themselves. There was an identification of a strategic moment. Here is a specific policy need. There were allies within the organization that were the interlocutors in bringing the idea into the institutional context. And there was an honest collaboration between researchers and refugee-led organizations in terms of what's the process by which we can work together to deliver something, and Ana Maria, to your point, that is seen as legitimate and authoritative, not just by the institution, but by refugee-led organizations as well, right? And so it's that idea that there are, if academics did it on their own, if RLOs did it on their own, we may have come to the same answer, but the way that answer would have been perceived, the authority, the legitimacy of that policy outcome would have been seen as very different by different institutional actors. So I think, there's a substantive value, but there's also a highly strategic value in responding to those needs and opportunities that are identified by those who work most closely on the issues, but then to develop the methodologies and the approaches that are going to produce something that is substantive and defensible from an evidentiary perspective, but also from that perspective of legitimacy and accountability. And I think that's the magic piece that happens. And how that can be done at scale in response to the moment that we face right now, that's the critical question, is how do we develop an accumulation of evidence that a co-produced approach to engaging with the policy process results, and this is not making it up, and that when the UN General Assembly affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees in December 2018, paragraph 34 says that responses are more effective when they meaningfully engage with the people they're intended to protect and assist. So there is a recognition that it's not just ethically desirable, but that the outcomes of a process are going to be seen as legitimate, not just by institutional actors, but by the communities that would then supposedly be the subjects of those policies. And I think that's what we've learned in public policy making, in health, in education, in any other sector. Why would it be any different when it comes to global forced migration policy?
I see a question online around global economic forces. How could and should refugee advocates bring in actors like the IMF or donor states, Treasury finance ministers, which play a huge but largely unacknowledged role in migration and protection dynamics. Stephanie, can I go to you for that?
Yeah, so with another organization, Refugees International, we've been doing research on the role of multilateral development banks. So it's not directly IMF, obviously, but what we found is that I'll put it very simple, because it depends on political will, if they want to accept money or do projects with the World Bank or in the case ADB, FDB, all the Asian banks. And it's not about acknowledge what the role of the finance minister or the ministry are. I have spoken to a lot of finance ministers on this topic and how they do projects. And it's like, it depends on the prime minister, on the president, or on the people who's in charge in the cases where countries, they have ministries of immigration or migration authorities. So it always comes down to political will. And I think also what we found is like there are a lot of technocrats in this, like what you call in the question, the political economic world or financing for refugees and migrants. But it comes down to what the decision makers want or not want to do. So I'll give a specific example. For instance, in Colombia, in the National Development Plan of this administration, there's like 2 or 3 paragraphs regarding migrants and refugees, although we have 3 million Venezuelans that have arrived in the past 7-8 years. So how come? And then when it's passed to Congress, the budget for this is 0. Despite all the, despite we have temporary protected status, despite we have good integration policies, then it comes to budget 0. So more than the technocrats in the ministries of finance, I think it's political will of Congress and of decision makers. I will leave it there.
I think that's all the time that we have for questions. So I will just give a quick summary. And we've heard from the different speakers, both from regional, global, refugee-led organizations and working directly with forcibly displaced communities. And obviously our partners here in academia who have been working with us side by side over many years. We started this conversation talking about really the dire challenges that we see unraveling in the world around us. And it's not just in the global refugee space, but we see a lot of backsliding of human rights and multilateralism and cooperation on all fronts, not just within the refugee regime, but in particular within the refugee regime. We've heard about the challenges that we're facing directly in mass deportations, in externalization policies, and the money that's been spent in border security and keeping refugees out, rather than supporting the commitments that states have made under international law to uphold protection rights. And as James put it, we are now seeing the rupture of the humanitarian system as we know it. So it comes at a time when the next High Commissioner will be appointed at the end of the year, one that will lead an agency that will be very different to the one that we've known for many years. And in light of all these challenges, we've gathered here today to talk about this particular project that we're embarking on. We're not trying to solve all of these issues. It's impossible for us to do so. And we're not naive to the fact that there will be states and there will be actors that are going to continue revoking rights, withdrawing from key international frameworks and protections, and continue to engage in policies that are in direct contravention of the international law and in many cases their own domestic laws and their own constitutions. But amidst all of this backdrop, we're aware of all the challenges and the crises around us, but we still choose to come together, not to give up, to come together to think about the possibilities that we have in our respective organizations and the positions that we come from, and thinking about possibility towards a new response to forced migration. And I don't think that is insignificant. The power of people deciding to continue despite such dark times, to come together and to make a decision that this is something they believe in enough to continue fighting for. And this is what I think this project is about. We've just gathered in Ottawa to launch the start of the 6-year partnership between forcibly led organizations, academia, civil society partners. It's a long list of partners, and that is what should continue to give us hope that there are so many people and so many organizations that are willing to be brave enough to imagine a new system and a new response to the challenges that we're facing. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your interest, and we hope that we continue to engage with you as we embark on this exciting 6-year initiative. Thank you.